Thank you so much. And thank you all for having me. I have to admit a little confession before everything. Helps things go smoother. So while I was writing this paper, I ended up speaking with one of my mentors. And I said to him, Father, I'm really struggling with this paper because I cannot, for the life of me, decide whether or not I'm writing a clinical paper or a theological paper. And he just smiles at me and he goes, good. And that's where he left it. And that's where this paper has kind of ended up. And so I'm going to start from where my beginning point was with all of this, which is as an addictions counselor. And in my line of work there, I find that the best approach is kind of this reverse engineering of the addiction. And in reverse engineering the addiction, we start with, okay, what's your primary substance? Is there any secondary substance? Is there a tertiary substance? What's the behaviors that come from those substances? What's the behaviors that are encouraged by those substances? This sort of thing. And ultimately what you end up getting to with every single person, literally every single person, is that it's never just an addiction. And I think this is our number one foul as a society, is that we approach these things as they're being ailed by the addiction and the addiction alone. But what we have to realize is that there's so much more to that addiction. There's so much more that prepared us to receive that addiction. And so that begins to be my starting point with this topic of the healer. Because what I have come across also within my work, right, is that there are healers out there struggling with addiction, which is mind-boggling to me. But it just reinforces this point again. And I think Dr. Gabor Mate put it best. He said, not all addictions are rooted in abuse or trauma, but I do believe that they can be traced to a painful experience, a hurt that is at the center of all addictive behaviors. And that's the very thing that we see with this kind of, again, reverse engineering of addiction, is that it was rooted in some sort of pain, something that was inexpressible, as Deacon Stephen Muse put it, this sort of untold story. That just is struggling to be told. And in the paper, unfortunately, we don't have the time for me to go over all three of these case studies. But in the paper, I highlight three case studies. The first one in particular was a client of mine who was an oncologist. And when he first came to the place where I had received him, he was very successful at what he was doing. He was in the middle of his life. He had a wife and 3 children, and was just taken on into a new practice. And there was a great deal of regalia that came along with this. He was given a new title. He was put as head of a department. And he had a bunch of fellows who were going to be learning underneath him. And sure enough, we see this process, right, of what I'm trying to introduce here, which is compassion fatigue, take place. And so as this oncologist is boggled down by more and more and more responsibilities, we see his patient interactions start to fail. And by fail, I mean it's not necessarily the case that their treatment isn't working, but fail in the sense that he is struggling to find any point of relation, any human point of relation with his patients. One patient becomes patient number 1. The next patient becomes patient number 2. The next patient becomes patient number 3, and so on and so on and so on. And that's how the day goes for him. Rinse, wash, and repeat. You also see this compassion fatigue affecting not only his patients, but his family. And again, unfortunately, I don't have time to go into the details of this, but it basically escalates to this point of where this man is hiding bottles of alcohol within his house. He's hiding them from his wife because his wife at some point did identify, I think you have a drinking problem. You're drinking during the children's baseball games. You're drinking whenever we have company over. You're drinking just watching TV, right? And so he begins to hide his addiction. He begins to put bottles at strategically placed locations throughout the house. And eventually what we end up seeing is this oncologist addiction, which, again, was rooted, I think, very much within this opening that was allowed by the compassion fatigue, this undiagnosed compassion fatigue, ultimately comes into his professional life as well, and he loses his job because of it. The second case study that I highlight within the paper is of a social worker, somebody who I worked closely with. And this is a different sort of experience where we see somebody who is very young, fresh out of school, right? And within 6 months of starting her clinical work, she also begins to suffer this compassion fatigue. And it's because of the consistent trauma that she was exposed to working out on the streets, right? The consistent situations of just absolute deprivation and destitution, that she begins to find herself joking about the client's situations. She jokes about them, again, as kind of one of these protective measures for herself. But eventually what ends up happening is this transforms into resentment towards the clients. They don't know how good they have it. They don't know the kind of resources that they have available to them aren't resources that everybody has available. This sort of manipulated idea, right, of they have it better than I do. They're being cared for, I'm not. And within 6 months of this woman's entrance into social work, she burns out and leaves the field completely. The third, and this is where I think you'll see what I was talking about with my mentor before come into play, I find from the Old Testament. And this is the case of Balaam, the Old Testament priest, who he himself also, I believe, suffers from compassion fatigue. And before we get into that, I want to take a sidebar here and give you a definition for compassion fatigue, which is the psychosomatic distress due to chronic use of empathy when treating those who are suffering. And so here we have, obviously, the doctor, right? We're seeing how he's treating those who are suffering, and seeing how he's consistently having to use up the empathy that he has available to him on a daily basis, to the point of where his empathy reserves are lower and lower and lower at the start of every day. The same thing with this social worker. And then with the priest, it comes in a different sort of way. Very much the same, but a little bit different. And so before we get into Balaam and his suffering and his compassion fatigue, I kind of want to go a little bit deeper into where does this compassion as it is come from? And if we take the most basic model of the psychosomatic existence, right, and we take that psyche and drop it down away from the soma, away from the bodily experience, right, and we understand that psyche experience, that psyche, right, and we drop it down into a basic two-part Aristotelian soul, right, and we see this as it divided into the logos, right, the word, the cognitive, logical intellect, right, and the pneuma, the spirit, this emotional center that has these undefinable barriers, this very spiritual existence which we're able to acknowledge but not quite able to understand. And what we see happening is this compassion is centered within that spirit. It's centered within our spiritual self. This is where we get this feeling as though we should care for somebody else or care for something else. Because if we leave it to the strictly logical mind, there is nothing logical. There is nothing that makes sense within the cognitive process to care for another. And so what we see is this compassion rooted within the spiritual self, within the spiritual center of the pneuma, right? Of the pneuma, the spirit, right? Which, again, is all part of this psyche, the soul. Okay? From there, right, we have this spiritual center that then allows for the logos, right, this cognitive, logical intellect, to translate that compassion. And in the translation, it can either amplify, right, and augment that compassion, or it can distort and manipulate that compassion. And so what we see then with compassion fatigue is a distortion and a manipulation of that compassion. Because at some point in time, we stop seeing compassion as coming from an unknown place and start to believe in our minds, as twisted as it is, right, that we are somehow the source of that compassion. And so we go back to it. And we return to that source every time, expecting to get what we came for, expecting to receive from ourselves, which, again, seems a little bit twisted and self-serving, right? And with that compassion, we also start to see a mix-in of two other elements. And those are the elements of justice and mercy, with which Father Dimitri Staniloy, right, identifies justice and mercy are two of the superessential elements of God and God alone. No one else can offer justice and mercy except for God. And yet here we are as healers, again, having distorted this idea of compassion, believing that it's coming from me. Right? I'm the one who is giving compassion. I'm the one who's created this. I'm the one who has the empathic abilities because of me. Right? And we distort this as well and think, well, if I can do this, then I can also bring justice to this situation. I can bring a hand of mercy into this individual's life. And the minute that we believe that we can bring mercy into a situation with another human being, the minute that we believe that we can serve any justice, we have just crossed that boundary from empathy into sympathy. And that once very beautiful and awesome reflection of one person onto another, again, becomes distorted as you are now looking down upon another person. You're seeing them as a victim, as a subject, and something that you can do something about. Which, again, we have to recognize is completely and totally distorted. Nowhere within our understanding of self, nowhere within our understanding of how we are to relate to one another, is there any evidence that we can change somebody else's situation? So back to Balaam. Balaam did just that. Balaam believed that he could change the situation. He believed that despite what God had told him when he asked God to curse the Israelites, despite God saying, I will not curse them, Balaam went off believing that he had the power, that he had the ability to bring curses upon this blessed people. He went so far, right, as to get onto a donkey, have that donkey talk to him, and still say, nope, I'm going to do this. He went even further as to make several unsuccessful sacrifices at altars with no yield, and still believed that he had the capacity. Balaam's lack of success is the very point where we see this compassion fatigue manifested. Whenever we're finding ourselves at this place of a lacking in success in whatever it is that we're doing, especially when it comes to expressing empathy towards another, what we have to realize is that we ourselves have become utterly broken and utterly crushed. And it's only in acknowledging that brokenness, that crushedness, right? That's when we can start to turn back to the real root of that compassion. It's the same person that brings us justice and mercy, and that is God. And I'll kind of close with this sort of idea, which comes from Henry Nouwen within his book, The Wounded Healer. And he says, it is not the task of the Christian leader, or in our cases we can say the Christian healers, to go around nervously trying to redeem people, to save them at the last minute, to put them on the right track. For we are redeemed once and for all. Christian leaders are called to help others affirm this great news and make visible in daily events the fact that behind the dirty curtain of our painful symptoms, there is something great to be seen. The face of God, in whose image we are shaped. Before we begin these acts of self-care that are clinically prescribed to those suffering from compassion fatigue, we have to acknowledge that we need to be cared for. And that first step of care can only come from one place, and that's from our Lord. And ultimately we get to this place where this compassion fatigue, if we are consistently acknowledging our brokenness, humbling ourselves, and recognizing we can do nothing. We are not the active bodies here. Then we can transform that compassion fatigue into compassion satisfaction, knowing that we are doing all that we're capable of by being a presence, by being there, perhaps in silence.
Questions for the Father Deacon?
So I'm a little, really great talk. I'm a little confused because we had someone else here speaking about sympathy and empathy and the fact that, and I don't remember who it was, somebody here who may have heard that talk, that the Greek is sympathy,
Sure.
but empathy is of a German origin. So what?
I'm not familiar with that.
Okay.
From my understanding, empathy comes from M.Pathos, so to enter into, but whereas sympathy, right, sympathos, entering with. So you're watching a movie, for example, and you see something horrendous happen on the screen, right? This is not empathy, what you're expressing when you start crying. This is sympathy. You feel bad for what just happened, right? And so again, you're with that sort of emotion. But in order to embark, right, this is how I kind of think about it, right? Empathy, embark, right? In order to go into that passion, in order to go into that experience with somebody else, right? It takes a certain level of guardianship, you know? And so that's kind of that. You have to make those boundaries clear. You're not there to cry with them. They may be crying, but you're there to support. It's not your pathos. It's not your struggle. right? It's theirs. Don't make it yours, because when we make it ours, that's when we get into trouble. Does that make sense?
But then what do we do with, weep with those who weep?
What do we do with those?
Yeah, with that line from Scripture. Like when you say be with them, sometimes it means you're going to weep with them.
Sure. I guess, again, this is more kind of situationally based. I would not, just for me, given my clientele and their own vulnerability, I don't think there would ever be a situation where it would be appropriate for me to weep with them. However, if we're talking about a long-standing relationship, right, between the counselor and the client, and that client has built up some sort of rapport, and again, this is all situational, but I think it would have to be kind of the call of the clinician on the spot. Because there's the other reality here of, right, Christ acknowledges humanity all throughout the Gospels. And he acknowledges humanity by kind of giving us these sort of nods. Christ going away into the desert after working a great miracle, right? This is him acknowledging our humanity. Because Christ doesn't need a break, but the humanity of Christ needs a break. And again, I'm verging on blasphemy here, so without going any too much further with that, it's again this human element which I think makes us unique.
So I appreciated your ideas. I just wanted to comment on these concepts of empathy, compassion, and sympathy, and I've seen a variety of definitions. Mm-hmm. And the one that makes most sense to me for empathy is knowing, sort of experiencing the emotional and affective state of the other person. And a higher order of empathy is understanding it. So why is that person experiencing that particular emotion? That's a real human connection. Sure. And then, so that's a passive event. I'm there with you. I know and understand you. I feel your pain. Yeah. Compassion is the action one takes in response to that recognition.
Absolutely.
So that seems to fit. And I agree with your definition of sympathy. Yeah, I feel badly for you, but I really don't. I don't understand, and I'm not really experiencing or understanding fully what is happening to you. Mm-hmm. So the more powerful of the concepts, it seems to me, is empathy, because you're really connecting with the person, and then if you know how to respond compassionately, then you can make a difference, and that can be in any form. If you're a surgeon, instead of go and read in the literature and plan that surgical procedure, so your patient's surgery is successful and they get better, and that would be an act of compassion that may be partially generated by the physician's understanding, empathic understanding of the patient.
Absolutely, yes, thank you.
Is it inappropriate to utilize some of the defense mechanisms like humor or limiting your workload because it facilitates a misunderstanding of compassion?
Again, I think it's a balance. It's situational, very much case to case. In a way, you absolutely have to defend yourself, because nobody else is really going to do it for you. And when you get to that point where somebody else is doing it for you, usually you've been in over your head for some period of time. So no, I don't think it's inappropriate to put up guard on occasion for self-preservation.
Just in connection with your observation a minute ago, sympathy and empathy are something that I work with a lot too. I just dealt with shame and guilt, and that was enough. But sympathy and empathy are, and I appreciate what Chris had to say too, with the root from the Greek, in sympathy. But we're 21st century Americans, and most of us our first language is English, American English. And so in American connotation, sympathy can actually be a negative concept. Down in the Deep South, if I was sympathetic for you, bless your heart. You know, and what it meant is, I'm glad it's you and not me. You know, yes, I feel sorry for you, but I'm really happy that I'm out of this. Whereas empathy is, I felt that pain before. I don't know what you're feeling right now, but I felt that pain before. And just like you mentioned, sometimes we can just sit there in silence because we know what that pain is. And so that's weeping with those who weep, I think.
Yeah.
So.
I just liked how the main idea that you just related it to the main point that we all need God, that there is this emptiness and nobody alone can do it. And no matter how, what language-wise, and I come from Bulgaria, I also can think in many different ways. I think that the West kind of thinks upside down to the East in many ways, and it boggles my mind. But no matter what, I was thinking about kind of like careful with that, but there's this, in a small manner, art activity in therapy that I use with my patients. It's on empathy and sympathy. And I ask them to draw a little puddle and imagine it's a deep water puddle, actually, like let's say a lake or something. You see a person there is a tree outside, there's another person. So the person outside, how are you going to go and save that person? I mean, most of the time they say, I'm just going to jump in and get them. And then we start talking, what if there are alligators? What if the water has some kind of a turbulence? What if something is happening? So that's the sympathy and those, at least in that book that I was using this example from. And then we talk about, okay, to really save somebody, to save their lives and yourself not drown with them, how about use the tree log or construct or something to hand it to them. So again, on the edge of this is a very rough example, but we need outside help basically. In no way can I compare God to a log, for the mercy. But I just like this, so thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Tom. I'm a urologist from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And it strikes me that in reference to, we were just, there was a comment about crying or shedding tears with your patient. And after really 24 years of clinical practice and then 6 years of residency before that, you do have to isolate. We all recognize you have to isolate yourself or else you would get swallowed whole in a very short period of time. But in every specialty, it's probably going to be different. We're exposed to different traumas, but there is going to come a time in your practice when not to cry would be somehow to deny your humanity. And I can't say when that is for every single person. We were just sitting here. For me, it was the night I had to go in and talk to a family whose mom had died of bladder cancer. It was somewhat expected, but I had been through a lot with them, and it seemed almost wrong not to at least and it wasn't manipulative or anything, but I don't know. That's all I had to say.
Oh, yeah.
I thought I had more, but it's not there.
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you all very much.